It's episode 99. Previously on the British Broadcasting Century podcast. Our chronological timeline, well, I suppose all timelines are chronological, otherwise what's the point? Well, it's brought us up to the BBC's first summer of 1923 and their first government inquiry. But how did we get here? Well, at the end of the First World War, the Marconi Company publicity chap Arthur Burroughs pitched to his bosses, including one Godfrey Isaacs, the idea of broadcasting. But they couldn't see it. So 2 years later, February 1920, some music has made it onto the airways for the first time. And the Marconi managing director Godfrey Isaacs is there once again for that to happen, as is Mr. Arthur Burroughs. Then you have Dame Nellie Melba's enormous broadcast in June of 1920. Godfrey Isaacs and Arthur Burroughs are there yet again. After a government ban, broadcasting returns in 1922, and as lots of companies try and iron out how this broadcasting scheme may work, one of the key voices in that, once again, is Godfrey Isaacs. But was he the key voice that helped create the BBC idea? Well, this time, this episode lands on the centenary of Godfrey Isaacs' death, so we thought, let's amplify and celebrate his name a little more. He's been a walk-on part in this podcast so far, especially in the early days, but relatively recent research from one academic has put that Marconi boss Godfrey Isaacs at the very heart of the BBC idea in that summer of 1922. So let's hear from him, shall we? From the University of Bristol, David Prosser joins us, as does Godfrey Isaacs' great-great-grandson, Robert Godfrey, to give us this biographical tale of a man who went on to be a director on the board of the BBC, and may have come up with the idea of it to begin with. This is episode 99 of the British Broadcasting Century.
Hello, this is Paul Carenza calling.
This is London Calling.
Hello, I'm Paul Carenza. Thank you for joining us. Episode 99. Look at that. Our last time in double figures. If you'd like to submit something for treble figures, by the way, next episode, love to include some of your highlights of the story so far of British broadcasting. What particularly inspires and excites you about the early Beeb tale? Basically why you're still listening to this. You must be here for some reason. Do drop me a line, paul@paulcarenza.com if you would like to. That's Kerensa, paul@paulcarenza.com. And you can either write something in wordage or you can record a voice memo, and maybe we'll include it on the next episode, number 100. But this time, this episode lands on what is the 100th anniversary of the passing of Godfrey Isaacs. Now, don't worry if you've never heard of him, but that's why this episode is here, to make sure that we can amplify someone who was a key part of the early British broadcasting tale. For much of this story, Godfrey Isaacs is the Marconi Company boss, who is nothing to do with broadcasting as such, but essentially running this huge company in Britain that was originally set up by Guglielmo Marconi, but he's retired now. So Godfrey Isaacs is a man of business, helping link up the world via telegraphy, telephony, wireless, but not necessarily via broadcasting. So once that idea starts to form that we could have something that, broadcasts news and entertainment into our homes, how does Godfrey Isaacs help shepherd that into being? We'll find out this time from two people who know pretty much more than anyone else on the planet about Godfrey Isaacs. That is his great-great-grandson and an academic who, in a brilliant twist of fate, on essentially day one of his research, well, I'll let him tell you. We have Robert Godfrey, the great-great-grandson of Godfrey Isaacs, and David Prosser, who is a doctoral researcher at the University of Bristol and former BBC producer. David, you had some fortuitous breakthrough in your research, didn't you?
Yeah. It was, in fact, the very first day that I went into the archives. I had this career at the BBC, and then I decided I was interested in doing history. So I went off to do a master's at the University of Bristol. And because in my time at the BBC, I'd been involved in some of the discussions around the license fee and the way we use the license fee. And it just, in a discussion with my supervisor, I think one of us said, I wonder where the license fee kind of came from. So that became, a decision must have been made at some time that the BBC would be funded by a license fee. So it's about going back into the archives to actually find out when that was. And to some surprise, the decision seemed to be made by the post office quite early on, kind of in the process. And I started my research the very first day at the post office archives rather than the BBC archives in Caversham. And if you read all the kind of history books like Briggs' great 5-volume history of the BBC,
I have it here in my hand. If this were a video podcast, we would see it now. But often referred to as the definitive history of the BBC. But so there's a question mark over this little patch of that. Isn't
Yeah,
it?
no, so he gets it. I think he gets this bit wrong because he hadn't seen what I saw. Great book that it is, but he's got a whole chapter which he calls "The Post Office Proposes," and it's this idea that in this very early moment when suddenly the technology allows for the broadcasting of sound, and you have a lot of manufacturers out there that can suddenly produce these things at a price, radio receivers at a price that the members of the public might begin to kind of afford. They want to do this. And I say Marconi is kind of like the leading company at the time. We're probably about sort of 80% of the market at this point, and a sense that things are really taking off across the Atlantic, kind of in America. Some quick decisions need to be made, and the post office, we know, brings together representatives of the wireless trade, as they call it, to the post office headquarters in London, just around the corner from St Paul's Cathedral. And according to Briggs and historians since then, so the post office basically knocks heads together at this meeting, and out of this meeting emerges this idea for them all working together, supporting a single entity, which a week later gets its name, the British Broadcasting Company, because it was when the big six from that meeting kind of get together. But it was very much this idea that it was in fact the post office that kind of like sort of forced them to do this. And so it's my first day in the archives, in the post office archives. I knew this meeting took place, and interestingly, if you go to the BBC archives in Caversham, there's actually a note there where you get to that part of the kind of files where it says no record. The BBC archive says no record of this meeting actually exists. Okay, but it does, because there I was in the post office archives, and it's literally my first day, and this big 28-page document comes, and I start reading it, and it's basically the transcript of that meeting, of what everybody said during that meeting, and who was there. And I'm reading it thinking, this is like really kind of interesting stuff. I wonder why I'm not reading this in any of the kind of histories the secondary literature that I've been reading. And it turns out that this document had basically been lost for several decades, and at some point during a kind of office clear out at the post office in the 1980s or early 1990s, it found its way to the post office archives. And most of the history books that we read on the BBC were written kind of before that time, so they didn't have, and I'm not even sure that a copy has yet made its way across to the BBC archives at Caversham, but I suspect it will kind of at some point. So we know exactly what everybody said at this meeting, and it completely changes this idea that the post office proposes. And that's why, when I wrote the article about this, I called it Marconi Proposes.
Indeed. Well, it's a fascinating article, and if only clearly historical research is so easy that day one you find this crucial document. It gives a very false impression of how easy history might be to research. But
I didn't actually realize this, because I was so sort of agreeing to the whole process. I didn't quite realize it was only sort of later on I kind of realized that actually nobody else had kind of seen this.
Well, we'll get to the that meeting then in a moment. But shall we? We'll build up to that meeting perhaps then by looking a bit of Godfrey Isaacs' story before there. So Robert, as his great grandson, I don't know much about my own great grandfather. So what do you know of Godfrey Isaacs sort of pre-BBC or any of those parts of his life?
Well, so he was from a very large family. He was born in 1866. There were a family of, I think, 8 or 9 children, and they were all, in some way, actually really quite driven. They were artists, they were musicians. Godfrey had 2 elder brothers called Harry and Rufus, and quite a lot is known about Rufus Isaacs, and far less known about Godfrey. Anyway, long story short, the family had a fruit and shipbroking business based in the city, and Godfrey's path had been set really to take over that business. So from a very young age, he was educated in London, was sent to Brussels and Hanover universities, I suspect to learn the ways of business and language. But I think he worked out that it really wasn't for him. He had this drive and ambition and insatiable appetite. He had this fascination with granite and gold, and sort of got involved in prospecting and all sorts of things. But in the whole process, he met a man who turned out to be Marconi's wife's brother. It was in 1909 that Godfrey had realized that, the family way wasn't for him. He was introduced to Marconi. So he had absolutely no experience of wireless, but had a lot of experience of business, multilingual. And there was some chemistry, I think, between Marconi and Godfrey. They just hit it off, and he agreed to become the joint managing director of the Marconi business then, I think, for 6 months. And then he became the main managing director after that. I think he just found the whole thing utterly fascinating. He had a ridiculous work ethic, and which we'll come on to if we have time, as to really, I think, part of the reason why we no one's really ever heard of him, although there are recently efforts to make him a little bit more well-known, certainly in Chelmsford, with the erection of a blue plaque that was up on the powerhouse of the New Street Works.
Only quite recently, last year or two, that plaque's gone up, isn't it?
Very recent. Yes, and ultimately he basically died of overwork. He died aged 59. And the reason why I sort of, again, don't really know huge much about him, apart from me talking to my grandfather when he was alive and various other things, was the whole family left England on his death, moved to Canada with pretty much everything never to be seen again. And it was just, it's actually quite a sad story, which is why it's rather nice to be able to talk and also hear about David's brilliant find, that actually it was him that had played very much a part in the formation of the BBC. So that hopefully is a little pen portrait of him.
The obituary, I obviously we are partly talking about the centenary of his death. It did mention overwork, I think, didn't it? It actually made it to the papers as a potential cause.
It did. I mean, what's so desperate is that so much of what was said in his obituary was there was an interview, I think, that he gave, and he said, all I want for the moment is sleep, rest and peace. Thinking, of course, that he said, I may not be away a year. He headed off to the south of France to convalesce. He said, if I'd allowed myself a proper amount of rest and recreation, taken my golf regularly, I should have gone on for a long time. It is a mistake to pursue work to the exclusion of everything else. I ought to have known what would have been an inevitable result. I have broken down utterly. Ugh. So again, it's very sad.
And he was 55, 58?
59.
59.
Yeah.
Yeah, and we don't have any memoirs from him. I mean, he died within a year of sort of retiring from Marconi. So as historians, we don't, he didn't get a chance to say any of this.
No, we don't. There were probably a dozen books written about Rufus Isaacs, and there's not a single book written about him, even though he does emerge from the pages. I mean, is it Asa or Asa Briggs? Yeah, he refers to him. He was a hugely supportive of Godfrey, and what's quite interesting, he refers to him as Sir Godfrey. He said Godfrey later Sir, and he wasn't knighted, as far as I know.
Yeah,
he wasn't knighted. But again, as I said at the top of this, a lot of people felt that he had been overlooked. He wouldn't have been really interested in that sort of thing, but I think what that might have done is made a few more people perhaps look into him and maybe write the odd biography on him. In fact, I think I might just sort of describe him to you. He was quite small, slight. There was a lovely memoir written about him on his death by T.P. O'Connor, he described him as having an ardent fire and yet soft and pleasant demeanor, a man to love as well as to respect. He was, determined, fearless, dominating, energetic, loyal, patriotic, which I think is rather lovely. And I think he had two personas. I think he had this unbelievable work ethic, and no doubt expected others to work as hard as him, and he led from the front. But I think he really genuinely was loved. Certainly on his death, the staff erected a wonderful monument to him in his local village where he lived in Virginia Water, which I think said something like in memory of something for their late chief. I should have the word, shouldn't I? But again, certainly his son, Marcel, my grandfather's father, would describe him in very much a loving way. He wasn't that sort of caricature of the dominant force, and he had this other personality. And I also, having read letters between him and his brother when his brother was in India, a great sense of humor. There was quite a lot of piss taking, really, if I'm allowed to say that word, but between the brothers.
Wonderful.
So yes,
Well, I used to live near Virginia Water, so when I'm back near that way, I must go and see if I can seek that out.
Lyne, Lyne.
Oh,
He's
yes.
in the churchyard at Lyne, and he lived at a house called Lyne Grove, which is now called Lyne Place Manor. It's been divided up
I
into
will be there
flats.
later this week. I'm going to go and have a
Great.
little pilgrimage. That'd be nice.
That'd be lovely.
So his sort of managing directorship at Marconi's wireless telegraph company then seems to 1910 to 1924, 14 years, but such a key 14 years in terms of the change from radio being essentially sort of one-to-one. You've got in that time the Titanic disaster, World War One, and then broadcasting. What a decade, I mean, not even a decade and a half.
We must mention also the Marconi Scandal, which he was intimately kind of involved in into 1912, 1913. And I'm interested in your kind of take, Robert, as well, because I think it sort of coloured perceptions to him and to Marconi. And I wonder if it feeds into it. And I think historians are divided about the Marconi Scandal. I mean, they see it as a sort of watershed, and it's like the kinds of things that would have happened in the 18th and maybe 19th century. Politicians getting involved in sort of private dealing was part. It was very much kind of part of politics. But we're beginning to enter in the 20th century this sort of new age of heading towards a kind of a democracy, and that the public wouldn't put up for this kind of thing. And so politics and the restrictions we put on politicians and the way politicians behaved is perhaps a bit different after the Marconi scandal than it was before. Now, I have to say, it was looked into. Nobody ultimately was kind of punished for any of this, and it was Rufus Isaacs, who's mentioned, was the Attorney General at the time, and shares in the American company of Marconi was sold to members of the cabinet, including David Lloyd George, who was the Chancellor of the Exchequer at the time. So, and I think there was just a sense coming out of it that it didn't smell good, and that the British public wanted, by this time, their politicians to have a better sense of smell. I mean, that's the way I would probably characterise it. I'm not an expert on the Marconi scandal, but I just wonder what you think, Robert, because I think this did colour perceptions later on.
Well, I'm really glad you mentioned it, because actually I do think it is a really, really important part of the story. So I think it was G.K. Chesterton who divided, in his mind, and he was very much involved with Hilaire Belloc in terms of the criticisms of this. And he divided history, I think, into pre and post that affair, or the Marconi scandal as it became known. I think it was a shame, because I think actually there's another element to this, and that's actually the sinking of the Titanic. Rufus and Godfrey and Harry met for lunch or dinner at the Savoy Hotel, which happened to be opposite the Marconi offices, about 4 days before the Titanic sank, 4 or 6 days before the Titanic sank. And Godfrey had been over in America, I think, taking control of a business that became the American Marconi Company. And he'd come back, and he had offered the shares in this company to Harry and Rufus. And Rufus said, well, I'm the Attorney General. I'm part of the Imperial Wireless Change discussions. I don't think it's probably appropriate for me to take these shares. And he said, well, yes, this is the American company, not the English company. It's got nothing to do with it. And I think actually in hindsight, probably Rufus should have stuck to that. But he didn't. He later, I think, secured some shares from Harry, who had bought them. And I think it was really the Titanic sinking that suddenly really cemented in people's minds how extraordinary wireless this phenomenon would become. And I just think it's actually unfortunate that the smell test, it didn't pass, somehow passed it later on. And I don't think that's too controversial to say. And I think actually there was a huge amount of sort of company protection. He was fiercely loyal to the Marconi Company and could see the possibilities of this being a really good thing for shareholders, and just hung on in there doggedly. And I think he probably didn't make the friends with the establishment, whereas Rufus very much did, and had an unbelievably stellar career, ending it as Foreign Secretary and Viceroy of India. But Godfrey, is not even knighted, even though actually a lot of people called for that later on in his career, particularly given his war work. But I think it really did taint it. And I think that stress, basically loads of elements, led actually, I think, to his untimely death. So I do think it's an important thing, and I think it's something they probably all wish hadn't happened.
Yeah, I mean, the point to make is that the British government was prepared to invest very heavily in wireless around the British Empire, Marconi was going to get the contract, and therefore the value of the shares in the American company were likely to improve, so likely to go up. So, I mean, that's the reason it doesn't, as you look back, it doesn't pass the kind of smell test.
Yeah, and I think what was relied upon, and I've got actually a copy of the this enormous sort of the select committee, and now and then I dip in and out of it. I think the issue was that it wasn't actually legal because these were the shares in the American company, and the American company was in no way associated with the English one in relation to this wireless chain. But if you said that today in a boardroom, you go, well, perception is actually more important than reality. It's sort of actually you're slightly, it's slightly disingenuous to say that actually, even though legally it didn't have a connection, of course there would be some glow that would flow from the English to the American in due course. But again, as I say, it didn't seem to have affected Rufus' career, and Godfrey, I think, carried it a bit, maybe.
He entered our podcast story. We've 100 episodes or so now, and right from the very first episode, I think the first reference we had to him was February 1920. They're doing musical, the word broadcast doesn't exist yet, but essentially a broadcast in Chelmsford with Winifred Sayer, the first professional broadcast artiste in Britain.
And then Mr. Ditcham put a thing like a telephone in my hand with no mouthpiece and told me to sing into it. I think we were paid 10 shillings. I didn't realize the importance of it all, but I was told by one of the gentlemen who came to the broadcast, Mr. Godfrey Isaacs, who was the managing director of Marconi's, told me that I had helped to make history.
Winifred Sayer, February 1920, when at this point it must have been such an experimental thing, and yet you have the head of the company is down there shaking hands, and the fact that Godfrey Isaacs was there witnessing one of the very first wireless concerts shows from day one he must have got this, must have understood where this could go. And then he's there for the Melba broadcast in June 1920, and there's a famous picture of Godfrey Isaacs and his wife with Melba.
And I know my great-great-grandmother would have absolutely loved that, because she was an opera singer. I don't know how good she was, but she sang Covent Garden, she arranged lots of charity concerts, and that lovely photo of the three of them standing there. And we have so little of Godfrey's stuff, nothing has because they all went to Canada. And the one thing I do have is his pocket watch, and that watch chain, you can see it in the photo, and I wore that on our wedding day. And it's just the only sort of touch point I've got really to him. It's rather sweet.
Then I think he's one of two people. He goes to America to check out the American wireless situation. I think in his case more for business development. And then F.J. Brown goes to America and comes back apparently talking of the chaos in America and how we should not be emulating the American route and try something different over here.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. There's these two key visits in that winter by Isaacs and also by F.J. Brown, who's the assistant secretary at the post office, and he's the person in charge of communications.
So F.J. Brown comes back from America to Britain and talks about the chaos in the ether on the other side of the Atlantic, causing the Postmaster General Frederick Kellaway to say in Parliament in early April, "It would be impossible to have a large number of firms broadcasting. It would result in a sort of chaos, only in a more aggravated form than that which arises in the United States, and which has compelled the United States to do what we are now doing at the beginning, that is, to lay down very drastic regulations indeed for the control of wireless broadcasting."
And this big concern comes from America. It's definitely overblown, it's definitely exaggerated, and he later kind of admits as much by F.J. Brown, this idea that the airwaves are being drowned in advertising chatter. They weren't at this point, the kind of interference he talks about came much kind of later on. But you can imagine it, if there had been some kind of free-for-all, anybody who wanted to sort of broadcast something, come and buy this from our store, could potentially kind of have done so. And I think that's, and I think we have to feed that into it, that people still weren't entirely sure what this new technology was going to be used for. And they were only just at this stage, people coming to the conclusion that broadcasting was the future for the new medium, rather than the idea of the airwaves being used as a kind of telephone for sort of point-to-point communications. And it's in that context that in America, the big stride that they make during F.J. Brown's trip to America is where there's a dispute has been going on in New York from a private telephone company that wanting to use it as the idea that you can actually phone somebody else kind of over the airwaves and they could talk to each other. And of course, some people were suggesting, well, that was kind of never going to work because anybody listening at that time could hear everybody else's conversations. But you're still reading at this time other people arguing, yes, but not everything we actually say over the telephone is private. So there will still be conversations that we could have. So this stuff was beginning to, enough people, and certainly F.J. Brown and certainly Godfrey Isaacs and probably the Post Office at this point was convinced that yes, broadcasting was the future. But that debate was still playing out.
Yeah, and I think that sort of gap year and a bit of 1920 to 1922, the Marconi Company themselves are sort of trying these things in different directions. There was the wireless, linking up the world wireless.
The Imperial Wireless Chain.
The Imperial Wireless Chain, that's the one. Yeah, thank you. Yeah. So you've got then, people like Arthur Burroughs, bless him, who since 1918 pitched this idea of broadcast concerts and politics and news, and took these, still pretty swift, within a few years getting it going. But the Marconi Company themselves, and with Godfrey Isaacs there, presumably almost hedging his bets a little bit in terms of, okay, well, we're developing broadcast music and broadcast concerts and ideally broadcast news, but also who is a giant question mark over what wireless could and would be at this point, I suppose.
Also, if you read David Hendy's work, one of our leading historians of the BBC, he will say, if you look at Guglielmo Marconi, the great man himself, we should remove him from any discussion about the development and the birth of the kind of BBC. I think on that he's right, because even up to the 1920s, Marconi's idea was that the broadcasting was not the future of this for this technology that he'd had such a huge part kind of inventing, but it was still going to be the idea. The commercial aspects were still point to point, using it as some kind of private kind of telephone kind of service. Godfrey Isaacs clearly, I think, didn't realize that broadcasting was the commercial kind of future for kind of radio. And so I also wonder whether by proposing a separate kind of entity that sat outside kind of Marconi, this was one of the ways that Isaacs not only kind of managed the government here and managed Marconi, the company's reputation, but also managed his own boss at the time.
Wow, I'd never thought of it like that. I think that is interesting because I've been looking for that sort of tension between the point to point and broadcasting, and I think I found that evidence of him definitely coming round to the idea. I mean, he certainly listened. Godfrey did, with Burroughs and Exesley and everyone. But yeah, his great project, of course, was the Imperial Wireless Chain, which actually didn't really come into being until just before his death. Yeah, the fact that there is this, you're almost sort of outsourcing it, having both the benefit and the burden, but in a measured way. I hadn't really thought about that before in relation to broadcasting. Wireless World, 29th April 1922. Got it here. There's a fascinating paragraph in an article which is headed "The Future of the Wireless Telephone." It says, Mr. Godfrey Isaacs looks forward to a time where there will be wireless receiving apparatus in every home, and he outlines a program for an organized public service which the Marconi Company is ready to put into operation as soon as the necessary authority has been obtained. And he goes on and he makes a statement. So there is something going on in his mind at that point. But so there was definitely something, brewing. And Godfrey says, I'm quoting here, I do not think that anybody realizes how big a thing this is going to be. So again, I know that's, if you think, well, he would say that, wouldn't he? That's within his interest. But actually, and he was absolutely right.
His plan was that the Marconi Company would take the lead to supply instruments to the householder on hire. Yes, hire rather than buy your radio set. Because modifications will be introduced from time to time in the apparatus, and once a man had bought his property, he would not feel happy if soon after he had to buy something better. So Isaacs is clearly predicting the fact that whatever stage wireless sets are at this point, they're going to grow pretty quickly, and indeed they were. The offshoot Marconi Marine Company, also based at Marconi House in London, they've been putting wireless operators on ships ever since the Titanic, and they also found ships preferred to hire sets rather than buy them to allow for latest tech updates. So the wireless and broadcasting industry are forming. and at the head of the most significant company is Godfrey Isaacs.
The way I describe it is that we think that it was John Reith that built the BBC. He was the architect of the BBC, and he certainly is the person that came in, but he didn't come in, of course, until the end of the year, until December of 1922. But he built it on these very solid kind of foundations. And those foundations were the idea that there would only be one single monopoly broadcaster. It wouldn't have to face kind of competition, that it would be a separate entity which was arm's length from the government with a license from the government, that it would be providing a public service. And that phrase, public service, is kind of very important, and it comes from this very meeting, and that it should be funded, at least in part, from a license fee. Since 1904, for quite a long time, if you wanted to have a sort of, you were an amateur radio ham and you wanted to have a little receiver or transmitter in your garage, you had to go to the post office and get a 10-shilling license. You also had to prove that you were a man, I think it did say man, of good character before you could actually get one of these licenses. So for 10 shillings. But some of that funding would come from the license fee for the BBC. Also, there should be no advertising. Now, the Post Office had decided in advance of the meeting there should be no advertising. Finally, that this single entity, the BBC, should have both regional programmes and share national kind of content between the various stations, which is how the BBC operated as a radio service for the first decades of its existence. So these are the basic foundations upon which Reith built the BBC. Now, all those come from this single meeting. And I think what I find really interesting is that this is not what the Post Office envisaged going into that meeting. The Post Office decided that the licenses to operate broadcasting services, they would only go to the radio manufacturers, the wireless manufacturers. Okay, which is why these 20 companies, 39 representatives in total, 20 companies came to the Post Office that day, and also that they'd ruled out that it should be used for advertising. And this chap F.J. Brown has a lot to do with that from his trip to America. And the 8 cities will be London, Birmingham, Manchester, Newcastle, Cardiff, Plymouth, and then Glasgow or Edinburgh. That's the kind of initial thing. But the Post Office at the outset, and it's interesting, it's Godfrey Isaacs who clearly comes out of this meeting as the dominant force in the room, even though he's not chairing it. It's being chaired by Sir Evelyn Murray, who's the secretary of the Post Office. But Godfrey Isaacs is clearly the dominant kind of force in the room. And he says at the very outset, almost like he sets the agenda, he says, well, I think, first of all, we ought to find out which of us actually want licenses to actually broadcast. And 20 of these companies put up their hands. And he then sits back and says nothing for quite a long while, for about sort of 8 pages of this transcript, where basically there is then a debate goes on about, well, how are we going to do this? Because the problem is that at that time, you couldn't use terribly much of the kind of spectrum, the radio spectrum, because the equipment tends to sort of waver around. So the big concern was different stations interfering at different times. So there's various things they suggest, like so each of these companies could have their own radio stations, their own broadcasting stations. They would broadcast at different times in these cities, and that these times could be registered with the Post Office. And the Post Office would organise that kind of thing. And then there's another suggestion, but what are we going to do about London? Because there's probably room in London for like sort of 5 stations, and you could have the Marconi station, which already, the experimental station that already exists, which is called 2LO. You could have that broadcasting from the centre. There might be room for 4 around the outside, and it's F.J. Brown who suggests, but they would have to be at sort of a lower power, because otherwise they're going to interfere with the Marconi station.
Isaac said, I oppose 2 stations anywhere as being totally unnecessary, undesirable, and an inefficient arrangement. Tell it like it is. It will be a long wait for a legal commercial competitor. It will be a long wait for a legal competitor to the BBC in London, LBC in Capital arriving over 50 years later in 1973.
So they've gone on like this for about sort of 8 pages, and it's pretty clear it's really hard to do, and it's going to be a bit of a mess. And then what happens is that Godfrey Isaacs, he sort of takes control, and he says, maybe I could suggest something from a businessman's perspective here. And of course, everybody's eyes light up at this idea. And he then makes a suggestion that, well, he says it's going to cost us £50, at least £50 per day to run a radio station. Now, that's all very well, whilst we're selling lots of these radio sets, but there will become a time when the market's sort of saturated. Are we going to want to continue to invest in our own individual radio stations at that point? And he makes a suggestion that would it not be better that we all combine forces, we all take an interest in a separate kind of entity, and that one entity then broadcasts the best that there is to offer.
Run under one management so that they may be properly coordinated, so that there may not be more stations than are necessary, so that they may be most economically and efficiently worked. I think that the most satisfactory way would be to create a separate entity in which all who have licenses should be interested, that should run the stations, and that should appoint the management of those stations. So rather than the post office proposing, the post office replied to that, saying, I do not commit myself to detail, and I do not know that it is our business to concern ourselves with those details. So the government actually wanted to have a bit of arm's reach over this and let the electrical companies get on with it.
And it's clear that this is very attractive as an idea for the post office because it's straightforward, it's sensible. They're simply dealing with one entity rather than trying to divide up between lots of different wireless companies. And somebody says it means we could provide the best public service. You could hear the best that there is to offer, and it's going to be concerts and it'll be information. At this point, there's a big debate about news, and we might sort of come on to that a bit later. There's then an intervention, and I think this is Godfrey Isaacs' real skill at this moment, is that Hugo Hurst, who's the head of the General Electric Company, he makes a suggestion that the 10 shilling license fee that the post office is already receiving, perhaps some of that license fee could go to this new broadcasting entity. Will get its name, the British Broadcasting Company, a week later. Maybe some of that license fee could go to ensure that it's able to broadcast the best programs. Sir Evelyn Murray at the post office, he's already ruled out advertising, and so he's on a slightly sticky wicket on this one. Godfrey Isaacs jumps in at that moment, and it says, that's a very interesting idea. We will work up a proposal for that and put to you. So he doesn't even say, would you like a proposal on how the license fee could be used? He takes that opportunity. So they come out of the meeting with this idea already established that this new entity, the BBC, could be funded by the license fee. And you could think about it, if that hadn't come out of that meeting, if later on, once you get into the sort of details, if the wireless companies, the new BBC that they were forming, to try to insert that later on, it would have been much easier for the post office to turn around and say, no, that's our money, But it's right there, kind of at the very, very beginning. And of course, and I think we know it's that sense of its independence from government and the fact it's got its own separate funding stream is what allows the BBC to grow into the BBC that we understand today.
But there was resistance, and that came from Metropolitan Vickers, which, as eager listeners may know, was a Manchester-based company that already had 2ZY on the air, which would, of course, become part of the BBC, and it had an American owner. So they didn't want one singular broadcasting company. They wanted competition, but Godfrey Isaacs maintained that the Marconi patents would need to be shared to make any transmitting station work effectively.
And so Evelyn Murray at the end, he says that he's prepared to consider an application for a license from one, or if necessary, two companies.
It was at another meeting in mid-June when Metropolitan Vickers of Manchester finally agreed that yes, one broadcasting company would suffice.
I think a number of these people recognised the potential of this new technology. And there's this wonderful line from one of the participants at this meeting that if we don't get this right, this new industry, this new technology, which we're so excited about and which promises such good business, could fizzle and die, if we get this wrong, and that sort of sense. And so I think he recognized the kind of potential there, but also recognized that he probably wasn't the best person to be making decisions about what the programming should be.
Godfrey Isaacs, on the 15th of August 1922, suggested it would be a good thing to have a wireless broadcasting company with the object of sending out music, bedtime stories, and jokes. What a marvellous idea.
This is probably a good moment to sort of talk about news and the broadcasting of news, because I think, again, I think Isaacs must give him some credit for this. There were two things which the Post Office came to that meeting with. Was one, that they were going to ban advertising. You couldn't have any direct advertising on the airwaves. But secondly, he had clearly, the Post Office, come under quite a lot of pressure from the newspapers, who feared at this time that if people got their news content direct from the radio, then they would no longer buy newspapers. They saw a real sort of commercial threat there. And clearly, the Post Office is minded to side with the newspapers and to do a sort of outright ban on the broadcasting of news by the new BBC. And it takes up quite a lot of the sort of latter part of the meeting, where these businessmen, and they are all men, I also think that's significant as well for one of the other reasons. But I think they really push back on this one, and I think they had a much firmer sense that radio was going to be part of the new democracy that Britain was becoming. We had universal male suffrage from 1918. Women had got the vote over the age of 30 in 1918, that all women would get the vote by 1928, and that radio was one of the ways in which people were going to gain their understanding of politics and be able to use their vote more wisely. And so they really push back against it. And what they do, they don't win this one because the restrictions on the BBC at the outset are really quite onerous. They have to wait until sort of after 9 o'clock in the evening before they can broadcast news. It has to come from the license says from 4 agencies, including AP and Reuters. They can't generate their own news. And it really takes the BBC, it's only really when you get to the Second World War that the idea of the BBC being its own news gathering kind of operation begins to kind of emerge. But what they successfully do is to set that up as a tension right at the beginning, rather than just sort of accepting that. And that the BBC is always going to be pushing to broadcast more news. So they don't roll over on this one. And I think they saw, probably better than the newspapers and certainly better than the Post Office at this moment, what the kind of potential was for the future of radio in this new democracy that Britain was becoming.
So there's the Godfrey Isaacs timeline, and of course there's the BBC timeline going in parallel. So 18th of October 1922, the BBC was formed at a meeting at the Institution of Electrical Engineers. It won't officially broadcast for nearly a month, but at this point, representatives of over 200 firms are present. We've covered this on the podcast before. The first directors of this new British Broadcasting Company are announced. Each is a boss of the big 6 electrical firms, and the first of the first directors announced was Godfrey Isaacs. He was joined by Archibald McKinstry of Metrovic, Basil Binion of the Radio Communications Company, John Gray, director of Hotpoint, yes, your dishwasher manufacturer, also known as British Thomson Houston, Sir William Noble of General Electric, and the 6th one, American Henry Peace of Western Electric. Yes, an American on the board. And there were 2 directors as well who were elected to represent the smaller electrical firms. You've got Whit Burnham of Burndet, and you can see my latest Patreon video for a visit to Burndet's site in Blackheath. I happened to find myself there and thought I'd record a little walk and talk video. Link in the show notes to that if you'd like. And the 8th director, also representing smaller firms, was Sir William Bull, director of Siemens, and an MP, in fact, who happened to have employed one John Reith 10 days earlier. And 5 days before this meeting, when the BBC was inaugurated, Sir William Bull actually showed young Reith a job advert for general manager of this about-to-be-formed broadcasting company. Reith applied, and while he's waiting to hear back, here is his boss, Sir William Bull, and 7 other directors, including Godfrey Isaacs, setting this new BBC in motion. Robert Godfrey.
There's another fun fact. I was looking at the Articles of Association of the BBC and the lawyers. So lawyers were Stedman, Van Praar and Gaylor. They were our family solicitors.
Oh, really?
So they've been acting for the family since, the 1870s. They became counsel to the Marconi Company and then drew up the Articles of Association of the BBC. But there was this sort of very much a sort of an Isaac's fingerprints on the BBC in not just Godfrey, but this maybe even the structuring of it as well.
26th of October 22, after the BBC has formed, but before it started broadcasting, Isaacs is with 7 others on behalf of the BBC at a meeting with press representatives. They need to work out whether and how the Beeb could broadcast news. So Godfrey Isaacs is there arguing that the BBC had just as much right to gather popular news, as he called it, racing and other sports results, and to broadcast these, as well as some news, just as the press would publish it. But the press, of course, disagreed. Nice try, Godfrey Isaacs.
Lovely letter that Arthur Burrows, the great Arthur Burrows, writes to Godfrey and says, I can go in 2 directions. Someone tells me I've got this particularly rare voice, head resonance. What do you think? Do you think I should be going into doing some speaking or whatever? And obviously the rest is history. We know what happened.
In the first few weeks of the BBC then, it's early December 1922, Burrows is asking Isaacs, respectfully, to submit for your consideration a statement on the future of broadcasting as a whole. How it could go, a policy, a plan, expenses, the size of the staff, that sort of thing. He wanted Isaacs to give the go-ahead. Firstly, Burrows wanted more than the 4 people that they were currently hiring. Burrows was interviewing to be one of them. Of course, John Reith was another. That's half the BBC right there. Burrows was at this point working between 11 and 17 hours a day on this broadcasting project, let's call it, at this stage. And if it's to become a fully fledged company and an industry as a whole, he's going to need some help. Performers would need to be paid, no longer voluntary. They needed kit, musical instruments, technical instruments. And could Burrows stay at the Marconi Company, working under Godfrey Isaacs as publicity director? Or was Burrows now full-time BBC? Well, he got the job he applied for, so that answered that question. Godfrey Isaacs was also involved in getting John Reith in as general manager. He was the last person to interview Reith and just double check that he was the right sort of chap for this, and indeed to settle Reith's salary. £1,750 was approved by Godfrey Isaacs, and Reith said, "I am profoundly grateful to God in this matter. It's all his doing." And not just God, but Godfrey Isaacs. Let's go to January the 4th, 1923. The board of directors of the Beeb, including Isaacs, meet and discuss the lack of money. Yeah, the thing is, you have to get a license to listen to the BBC, an official stamped approved set with BBC on it. But most listeners weren't, because there was a loophole. To encourage experimenters who were just interested in wireless generally, you could get an experimenter's license. But it was meant for proper scientific researchers and experimenters and people who were actually there in sheds and fixing all these parts together. People were now using this experimenter's license to build their own sets using foreign-made cheap parts and not really giving these electrical companies a chance to actually sell their sets to them. So Godfrey Isaacs and 3 others, Sir William Noble, John Reith and Basil Binion, they formed a very small committee to look at this issue of money. They realised the government weren't pursuing listeners without licences, and the government were giving out far too many experimental licences without checking if they were the real thing. So the government decided they'd have an inquiry headed by Sir Frederick Sykes to look into this problem. Reith was allowed onto the committee. Well done him. And Godfrey Isaacs praised Reith for his conduct in doing so. "I must have done something very special to make Godfrey Isaacs have such confidence in me," said Reith while he was serving on this Sykes inquiry. Isaacs was still then the one to impress.
Reith was promoted to managing director, and this was all agreed at the board meeting of the BBC, and Godfrey rang him, wanted to congratulate him, and Reith actually mentions in his memoirs how pleased he was that Godfrey had bothered to do that, and he said he's normally so undemonstrative.
Isaac said he couldn't find adequate words to express my admiration of you, Reith.
Yeah, he was rather sort of pleased that he'd got a blessing from the great man. The great man in this case being Godfrey and not the one that we all think of in relation to the BBC.
So the Sykes inquiry then is where we pick things up next time. But even within that Sykes inquiry, how quickly it was forgotten that Godfrey Isaacs was the one to suggest and champion a singular BBC just 1 year earlier. Look at the 8th of May 1923. The Sykes inquiry is underway. Sir William Noble's giving evidence to them, and he says, "It was the desire of the Post Office that we should have one company, and one company only, and we fell in with the view, and eventually the 2 sides, which were in opposition to each other, agreed to the view of the Post Office to have one company." Sir William Noble there, head of the Broadcasting Committee, pre-BBC, now one of the board members of the BBC. Yet forgetting that actually, as we now know from the minutes of that meeting, thanks to David Prosser, that Godfrey Isaacs was the one to take the lead. And he gave us one BBC.
I've got a letter, just a transcript if I got time, where Godfrey writes to his brother in India, and this is on the first anniversary of the 14th November 1922. He said, broadcasting is in, I think he says, the ascendant or something. It said, since you were here, I gave a dinner last Tuesday to celebrate the first anniversary. This has done for speech what printing did for writing. And it then says the Prime Minister came, spoke to the country, and was listened to by more than 2 million people. And it says the Viceroy of India will probably do the same very soon.
Wow.
Yeah. We don't know, of course, how Godfrey Isaacs would have dealt with the 5 years after the start of the BBC when it became a corporation. So in 1927, the involvement of these companies came to an end, and the BBC became a separate public kind of corporation. He was dead by this time, of course. I suspect he probably would have seen that was an inevitable and desirable kind of change. That's kind of my sense. Can I just say one other thing, which I think is sort of important? All these people we've spoken about in that meeting, and they're all men at this stage. And I think, I have no proof of this because no one wrote this down, but the very strong kind of reaction against the idea of direct advertising, I think hints that there is a gender aspect to this, because this was the period in the early 1920s where big department stores were now coming to their own. Women were voting for the first time. There was a growing sense of kind of female kind of autonomy. And suddenly we had this technology which was going to bring messages, voices directly into the home. Generally, when the men weren't going to be there, and so they didn't know necessarily what their wives or their children would necessarily kind of be listening to. So the idea of having trusted men managing that process was, I think, quite important at that time. So very, very few politicians, I should say, were ever involved in these kinds of discussions in the formation of the BBC. The politicians, as often happens with the new technology, were often kind of behind the curve. But an argument had to be made as to why only wireless manufacturers were being invited to this meeting and invited to actually set up licenses. And one MP who was the chair of the wireless kind of subcommittee, a guy called Sir Henry Norman, he wrote a couple of very influential articles for the Times setting out the government's case here. And he said, of course, every big retail house would like to shout the merits and low prices of its taffetas and tools, its shirts and shoes. There is no room for this. And so I think it's interesting that there is this new kind of commercial space, which was at that time, it seemed much more of a kind of a female space, was being sort of excluded from the birth of broadcasting kind of at the outset. But no one said this at the time. So it's a hunch on my part that they were thinking about what their own families were going to be listening to when they were off at work during this time.
The only women I think we've mentioned in all of this discussion, just because that is where they appear in the thing, is Melba, is Godfrey Isaacs' wife, who was an opera singer.
Yeah, Leah, yeah.
And Winifred Sayer as well. Another, so three singers, essentially.
Yeah.
And one who comes a little later, 1926-27, Hilda Matheson at the BBC, talks director. We've mentioned her a lot on the podcast, and we can't, resist another mention here, that when the BBC start being able to do news, because that sort of falls into her area a little bit as well, and discussion and debate and things, that she's there doing that. And then under her tenure, you get the Week in Westminster beginning, which is still on the air today, longest running political program, I think, in the world, and which again ties in with female suffrage. So all of those issues and a chance for broadcasting to bring those issues to the fore for home listeners. It's changed a lot since Men in Sheds, I suppose, in the early 20s. David, your article, I believe it's out there and readable if people look in the right place online. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I think if you just Google David Prosser, Marconi Proposes, it should come up. The full title is Marconi Proposes Why It's Time to Rethink the Birth of the BBC. And it was published in an academic journal called Media History, but it is available publicly.
Well, there you go. That's how I found it anyway. And it is readable, certainly. You can just find it. So thank you both for joining us. And thanks for helping amplify this wonderful tale of Robert's great-great-grandfather, Sir Godfrey Isaacs. Let's knight him right now. Sir Godfrey Isaacs. My thanks to David Prosser and to Robert Godfrey for their time and expertise in amplifying the life and contributions of Robert's grandfather's grandfather, Godfrey Isaacs, lost to us a century ago today, at time of this podcast's release. Next episode is episode 100. Your contributions are welcome. Still time for some words or any recordings you would like to send us of your voice telling us any bits you like particularly about the early BBC tale, any particular moments that tickle you or amuse you or interest you. And send it my way, paul@paulcarenza.com. We have a few already, always room for more. Other events this year: an evening of very old radio, back on tour, Petersfield, Newbury, Camden Fringe, Isle of Wight. All details on paulcarenza.com/tour, link in the show notes. Elsewhere, I'm presenting at some conferences. 100 Years of God on the Air at the Religious Media Festival, 9th of June. If you like religion and media, you must be there. Also at a Greenbelt Festival, Sunday 24th of August, I'll be doing 100 Years of God on the Air as well, in a big field in Kettering. If you know Greenbelt, it's a marvellous place. I'll be presenting also at the Early Recording Conference in Guildford, University of Surrey, 1st of July, talking there all about the very earliest BBC recording. So, lots of different stuff going on there. I'm also now on Substack, writing up bits and pieces there. Done a recent one on BBC statues, given that one has just been re-unveiled. Link in the show notes to that, or just go to paulcarenza.substack.com. Patreon, of course, is where you can support the podcast, £5 a month, and you get videos and writings and extra things. Thank you to all our patrons who support us there. Patreon.com/paulcarenza. And thank you for your support on there. It's kept us afloat for the last 99 episodes. Here's to episode 100. The British Broadcasting Century is a solo-operated podcast just run by little old Paul Carenza. Original music's by Will Farmer, but it's nothing to do with the BBC at large, don't you know? But we salute them and all they have done over the years. And this episode we particularly cheer for Godfrey Isaacs. Thank you for listening. Join us next time for episode 100 on what will be the British Broadcasting Century's Century.